Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session of the College of Arts and Sciences' 4th annual Gamecock Teaching Days. This year, we're showcasing some of the best high-quality online teaching we have in the College of Arts and Sciences, and we are so pleased that you can join us for today's session. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Hayden Smith. He's a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice and will be doing our presentation for us today.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So this work is a product of the virtual reality boot camp, along with the teaching incubator, my time, a couple of years at the teaching incubator with Christy Friend, that really changed the way that I do my teaching. So I'll begin with criminal justice. It's a large major, and it's very difficult to get students out into experiential learning. We're one of the few disciplines that have a big disconnect between what we do in the classroom, it's conceptual, and the practitioner base. There are some folks that will go on to policing. Most people don't go to get a criminal justice degree for corrections. And if they go through the courts, they tend to go on to law school. So often there's a disconnect between what we're trying to do in the classroom and what we're doing in the real world. So a lot of my research has focused on what happens in the classroom and measuring outcomes. And years ago, I started doing some work on prison tours. That was the origin of all of this. I published about 3 articles where I took students out into the field and did prison tours. And there was kind of some critics who published articles back suggesting that the mere touring of a prison was actually unethical. And it was kind of gawking at inmates as opposed to engaging in any sort of pedagogical outcome. So I worked pretty hard on developing kind of a step-by-step how to do these tours in a ethical manner. When I read a lot of their work, it was interesting because they were talking about prison tourism. So they were talking about Alcatraz, some old prisons in Pennsylvania, and they hadn't actually gone into the prison to be around inmates themselves. So one of the challenges I faced when I would do this with students was one, getting them in,
Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a great day. You too.
Getting them into environments that are restricted even for me. So inside, say, SCDC, there's 23 facilities now, prisons, and within those you have a psychiatric hospital that's governed by HIPAA regulations. Students can't go there. You have lockdown units where there's an additional security within, and that's where inmates are locked up for 23 hours a day. I can get into those environments, they cannot. And so you hit a wall, so that's one challenge. And one thing that the critics pointed out that I was like, I have to agree with them in this, is what they call the gaze or the zoo effect. And this would usually happen when we get to an inmate's cell, and the inmate would be touring with us and guiding the tour with the officer. And we would take turns, we'd ask for permission, go into the cell. And when they saw the inmate's personal belongings, like a Bible or a toothbrush or their bedding, they'd get very uncomfortable. They felt like they were gawking at them in a zoo, even though they gave permission and the inmate didn't seem to care. It still created something where I was like, well, we need a different approach to get around that. Because I did recognize that was a potential challenge in doing this experiential learning. At the same time, I did the boot camp, as I suggested, the teaching incubator, and COVID, which essentially stopped these visitations. And so I worked to develop these experiential learning opportunities using like different VR approaches, using 360-degree videos that are available on YouTube. And I'll show you some of those today. I will say that when I went into the boot camp and the teaching incubator, I had no previous experience in VR. And sitting in those classrooms, particularly the boot, you realize there's computer programmers and people that do some really high-end stuff. What I'm presenting today, I think, is accessible for everyone's classroom, and even for yourself to kind of reach out and look at different ways of learning things. The class that I applied it to is CRJU 426, an upper undergrad writing intensive class that focuses on criminal justice and mental health. So the 3 biggest mental health facilities in the country right now are prisons and jails, and there are more people incarcerated with mental health than outside of prisons and jails. So there's more people who have a mental health diagnosis incarcerated compared to regular society. So our prisons and jails operate as a default mental health system, and that's the aim of my approach. Another thing about what happens in the criminal justice classroom is without experience, students are very likely to think that a professor is imposing their own political viewpoint, their own beliefs, and they tend to disengage. And they also tend to get wrapped up in their phone or their iPad or their laptop. So I wanted to use some judo and actually make those things that they're touching and that most professors fight against an ally for us, that something that they use to learn. I did a lot of thinking about how to structure these, and I came across these 360 videos. One of the most important things that they offer is an inside-out viewpoint. So if you think about this COPS, which was recently canceled after 20 plus years, most of the time you don't realize about media bias in criminal justice, but they do focus on things like violence, predatorial crime, these type of more glamorous, media-prone kind of events. They really don't capture the things that you want to teach them in a classroom. And students, if they hear you talking about experiences, they tend to glaze over and disappear. Years ago, and I can't remember if it was a journal or a conference, I remember one professor tried to do something, this is before cell phones, where she had students sit on their bed and have no TV, no phone, nothing, just a notepad. And the goal was they were supposed to sit there for 4 hours and write down kind of the feelings that would come up, things like boredom, anxiety, try to promoting these emotions that can facilitate learning. Now, to be fair, in the modern context with phones, that's not going to happen. A student's not going to sit on their bed for more than 6 minutes without checking Instagram or something. It's just not going to happen. So I realized I had to take that concept and really update it and get something that was intensive. I will say, because the class is mental health, this is a public access. This is available to the public, this creation I'm showing today. In the classroom, it's a bit more advanced. There are videos where students can go in and experience the symptoms of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, some specific disorders. And as well as today, and for my students, there's always a trigger warning. So there's always an option to not do the assignment, stop if they're halfway through, report any issues to me and to the student health services. I haven't had that happen yet, and I recently published on this because it did produce some really big outcomes. And we did it in 2 different states, about 300 students, and the students were very hungry for this type of learning. Some of the feedback was, we're not opposed to reading books, but we are opposed to getting beaten over the head with PowerPoint slides all day or a lecture. And so this adds a form of visual learning and experiential learning that can reduce the risk of going out. It can reduce the zoo effect. And it also creates an inside-out view that you don't get from the media. The main show of corrections is probably Locked Up, and even Locked Up is an outside the cell looking in viewpoint. And what I'm trying to teach in the classroom is more complexity, more challenging ideas, and also give them students an inside-out viewpoint. What's it like to be inside these environments? Because most of the concepts we teach are actually an inside-out viewpoint. While we're providing imagery of outside in. Okay, so without further ado, let me see if this can work. Okay. Can you see the website? Yep. Okay, good. So this was developed via the Teaching Incubator, and you can see the tabs. It's pretty straightforward: Home, About Me, Food for Thought, Tour, and Learn More. And you can see I've given a shout out to Lydia and Christy and Rachel here. So everyone, and Nina. So they made a big influence on my teaching and changing the way I do things. The next tab, About Me, here we go, has my beautiful picture. Then we get to Food for Thought. So I'm actually going to ask you guys to have a go at these questions if you want to write a little note to yourself. There's 5 quick questions. These are the 5 questions that I would ask anybody who is interested in corrections and criminal justice to get an idea of some basics and see how your perceptions match reality. So the first question is, how much does it cost to house an inmate per year in state prison? So total cost per inmate, state prison, and that includes everything: housing, food, medical costs, etc. $33,000 a year, 80 or 150. Okay. The second question is, in female prisons, and we're talking about state prisons here, what percentage of inmates have a diagnosable mental illness? 11%, 33%, or 66%? Number 3, what percentage of federal prison inmates are incarcerated due to a violent crime? So federal prison inmates incarcerated due to a violent crime. 8%, 28%, 78%. Question 4, what percentage of all prison inmates receive a visit every year? By visit means one visit for an entire year. 1 or more, okay? 11%, 33%, or 66%. And that's national. And then the last one, what percentage of all inmates in prison will return to society at some point? 35%, 65%, or 95%? So this is an exercise that I open up with the class, and then I break it down to later they do the actual experiential learning with writing assignments and other things. So let's have a look at the answers and see how yours compare. Okay, so the first one, the correct answer is about $33,000 a year. Depends on state. I provide more information here. Alabama's 14, New York's 69,000. And I provide more information showing that there's actually a lot of variability. Inmates such as women who arrive to prison pregnant, inmates with mental illness, geriatric conditions, often cost a couple of $100,000 a year. But the average is about $33,000. In my class, I talk to students about incarceration actually being an intervention, because it can be a physical or mental health intervention. It's often the first time some of this population has experienced a doctor or a therapist. Not the best way to find help, but they do often have to deal with a constellation of medical and health problems. Female prisons, the correct percentage is 66, or 2/3 of all female inmates have a mental health condition that's diagnosable. You've got to assume that there's probably another 20% that are on the border of that. So we are dealing with default mental health systems here that are not designed for that. They're designed for security and safety. They're not designed for that originally, so we can get into deinstitutionalization and other issues with that. We can also get into issues of gender, because the male estimates are about 30 to 40%, but we know that male inmates don't report their symptoms, don't seek help, and don't continue on with help. Okay, there's also some other issues such as males in gangs in prison. They tend not to want their gang members going into therapy because they might talk about things they're not supposed to talk about having to do with the gang. So it leads to more discussions in the classroom. Federal prison inmates incarcerated due to a violent crime. Students are often surprised, 8%. Even in state prison populations, students are very surprised to see the actual number of violent crimes. They usually estimate them to be really high. Okay. I put a personal story here where I was doing research and I spoke to one inmate and I said, well, what would happen if you were ever in a fight? And the inmate looked at me and said, I'd lose because they didn't know how to fight. They'd never had violence before they're incarcerated. And while incarcerated, they weren't going to fight. It was just more like a skill as opposed to a tendency. So we work on those discussions in the classroom. This is another interesting topic, visitation. Nationally, only 1/3 or 33% of inmates get visited of any kind. That doesn't necessarily mean close family, friends. That can mean any sort of visit, a lawyer, a priest, a disconnected family friend. So you have to figure that number of people who are having visits from people that are close to them with social bonds is probably really lower than 33%. Now, there are issues about transportation. If the person's incarcerated in another state, we have location. But these are issues that often surprise students. Students often hear about this word reintegration, and that's actually a middle class word, because if you think about it, we're thinking about ourselves being incarcerated and we would reintegrate into the social bonds that we already have. This is a population that's often isolated, alienated, and disconnected to begin with. That's why these bonds don't exist. So we often assume there's a reintegration. We're assuming there's a social integration to begin with, and that's not always the case. And then the last one that often surprises people, 95% of all inmates who are incarcerated will return to society at some point. 5% will die while incarcerated. Most people think that through media particularly, that prisons and jails are places people just go and they never come back from. It's a way to deal with complex problems and make them disappear, okay? Were you close? Were you far away? We'll wait for the discussion for that stuff. Okay, so now let's go to the tour. This is the actual tour. As I said, in the classroom, I also link it to other videos. All of these videos are freely available on YouTube. Just put in VR or 360 if you're ever teaching a class or working on a topic that you like. You don't have to build a website. You could put it in Blackboard. I just couldn't use Blackboard to show this to people. And once again, if you get triggered, just let me know, or seek the free therapies that we have at school here. So what I do is I follow a basic system from corrections. So we start with this, a male who's been arrested, and this is Clackamas County in Washington State, I believe, or Oregon. And then you can move the viewer around. So you can also see, it's trying to move for me, you can also see what the officer is doing, and students can develop an understanding. There is sound. So it can stimulate the senses, because you get a sense of what's like to be inside of the car. In criminal justice, we do internships, and most police agencies do a police ride along, so students can also get this effect, but usually not from the back seat. Usually they're sitting in the front seat. Back seat sometimes can be a little bit gross, so you never want to sit in the back seat. Okay, so next stop on the tour, the person goes to court. This comes from the UK. This is actually more of an information that walks people through the court processes and tells you what's on each floor and what's going on. With all of it's really effective to find international videos. So for corrections, there's videos from Russia, Brazil, all sorts of different countries. You can do international comparisons. Students are often surprised to learn how matter of fact the court process is, how bureaucratic. It's not often emotional and highly charged like the media portrays. I'll start to move a little bit quicker because I want to be moving on time here. This is a really good video. It's a jail. So jail, incarceration of 1 year or less for misdemeanors. Jails also contain people who will be found innocent, people who will be sent to prison. Prison is a year or two or more for a felon, so more serious long-term crimes. What's really cool about this video, it takes you into a holding cell. So here, students can experience things like they can experience the degradation or humiliation of having to go to the bathroom with other inmates there. The inmates come and talk to the video. You can also explore things like the food. They're also, in this point, talking about racial differences, that whites sit on this bench, minorities sit over here. So they're exploring some racial issues that can occur in corrections. And I also draw the students' gaze to the officers, because that's usually a blind spot. Students will not look at the officers. And so I also draw their writing, their work towards this group, okay, because they will ignore them. It also goes into cells, so we start to get a sense of space. This is usually a medium level prison in case of jail, but it's two people to a cell. And this is what usually happens in a receiving and evaluation process. People are booked into the jail. They get checked by mental health, physical health. They may be looked at for tattoos, for gang affiliation, etc.
See my tats right here.
We're talking about his tattoos, etc. Okay?
What X-rated mean? Candyman.
We move on to Visitation. This is a very powerful video done by the New York Times. I don't know how I would be able to do this myself, and so I will use this. There's some that I do want to do myself. This is a real life visit of these two young girls going to see their dad in prison. Not a topic usually shown on the media, but they're sitting on a bus ride with
and that's when they turn on movies.
Going
and
to
after a while, I fall
You have
asleep.
complete control. You can look at the ceiling. You can look at the other families. They're talking. It moves on to the visitation room. Oh, sorry. A lot of criminal justice research talks about visitation, that the visitors are treated like inmates. They have to go through security. It's usually a time where contraband is exchanged, so officers are on edge. But you can see here where they're actually meeting, reuniting with their father. I also draw their attention to the volunteers. You see everything. They have puzzles and books, Jenga, other things to keep the family visit as intact as possible. What I really like about this is a lot of visitation research focuses only on the mother and the bond to the child, which is, of course, is important. And in some cases, they have special rooms that are like daycare centers to facilitate a more natural visit. But I also think that with the majority of people incarcerated being male, the connections to dads and fathers and uncles and grandfathers are equally just as important, and they're usually ignored. It also shows the return home on the bus ride as people are tired and discussing the tour. Move through the last couple real quick. For mental health, we move into solitary confinement. Some of them have to screen because they have some rather cheesy voiceovers or effects. This is one of them.
Of human contact for periods ranging from days to decades.
I've never seen a cell this dirty or this dilapidated,
the worst.
But
you can be sent to solitary for being suspected of gang affiliation.
So some of them you have to really screen, or I just have students turn the sound off. And what I'm looking for them to do with a lot of the writing exercises is experience this sense of space. It's a 6x8 cell. So I want them to experience what it's like to look at the ceiling like that for a period of time. This is 3 minutes. Most of the ones you want to look at, if you're doing it in your classroom, should be pretty short. As part of the teaching, you should facilitate the gaze. Tell them what to look at, okay? Almost done. So we've moved into the most isolated component of prison. And then this one comes from a frontline documentary. It's an inmate who's re-enters society. He talks a lot about his mental health, his self-harm, suicide, self-injury. It takes him from his cell, and then it takes him to his bedroom at his house. Inmates have a tremendous amount of problems on re-entry. They have high rates of death within the first 2 weeks, particularly the first 2 days. A lot of risk of suicide, homicide, and accidental injuries, gun injuries, other types of injury, car accidents. But they can live 10, 20, 30 years in prison, and they get out, and those first 2 weeks are really crucial. This
room has become my own personal prison.
He's reflecting on the challenges. Then he's talking about some of his returns to mental health hospitals as a result. So that's the tour in the classroom. I do, as I mentioned, add I add mental health components. I add other things that are available online. And one thing that I follow up with the students, or in this case, are reports. So for each of the 5 topics, there's more information, and these are easily accessible for the general public or for students, but there's links to the Vera Institute Marshall Project on kind of the themes that are within these videos. The cost of housing, inmate health, violence, visitation, and reentry. Each of these have their own link, and they take you, for example, the reentry one is one that I wrote for National Institute of Justice, and it's just like a report.